We are in Canada, a country that for, the last 100 years has its own precarious history, has some pretty serious things to face, as a country in terms of, reconciliation between Native people and non-Native people. Whether you're in support of Indigenous rights or whether you're in support of anti-racism and all these concepts housed within anti-oppression. Everybody in Canada, immigrant, born here, third generation, or First Nations, Inuit, all feels pretty messed up about our history, one way or the other. And we all have fairly different ways of addressing it. Some of us just bury it inside and just, don't think about it. Others, are proactive about addressing it and do everything they can to try and lift up those who have been most disproportionately affected by systemic racism to the forefront of the movement. And others do other things. But the fact of the matter is that this country for the last 100 years has been making some progress. There have been social movements, leaders that have stood up, to address historical things like Indian residential school, for example. And while the apology came from Prime Minister Harper, and I recognize that there might have been some authenticity issues with that apology coming from that gentleman, it's a very significant moment in history. And, we have leaders like former National Chief Fontaine who, talked about his sexual abuse in residential school and, in the media, which compelled so much in the form of policy, in the form of other discussions, and now we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission traveling across the country and documenting the testimony of grassroots Indigenous peoples who were abducted from their families and taken to assimilation schools, which are nothing more really than labor camps, and attempted to be assimilated into so-called dominant society. Now, the reason I bring all this up is because I just want to recognize that we've already got a lot on our plate in terms of Canada. But as you all know, in the last few years, things kind of have gotten crazy. We've got a neoconservative agenda being implemented by the Harper Conservatives that has gutted 40 years of environmental regulation, completely gutted, that has eliminated just about every checks and balance in our federal government. Now all roads, from a policy perspective, lead to the PMO, the Prime Minister's office. We've seen just about a couple thousand scientists in our government, issued, what are they called, pink slips? Is that what you call when you get fired? Yeah. Issued pink slips because the government doesn't want to hear good science. They don't want to make policy based on good, sound science. And we've seen, things like the Omnibus Crime Bill, which carry major and significant consequences, particularly for Aboriginal communities, ratified and passed. We've seen an incredible attack on the rights of women in this country. And this, to me, is most troubling, especially because in my own family, we have many of my aunties that are part of that infamous list of over 700 murdered and missing Aboriginal women in Canada, that have not had any justice served to their situation, that have not had, any addressing of it. And many of the families are still living with that incredible trauma. And instead of, investing money into the policing services, into the social services for these families that are trying to find, a way for closure, what does the Harper government do? They cut funding to the federal campaign Sisters in Spirit, which was the advocacy group working to try and, work with these families, that were so traumatized over the last many years. And there's a great